Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a city so beautiful, so ancient, so layered with memory and gold, that its very existence felt like proof that civilization was worth the trouble. Now imagine waking up inside that city on the morning it would cease to exist. That was Constantinople on May 29th, 1453. The sun had not yet risen when Theodora Palaiologina opened her eyes. She was 15 years old, an age when the world should feel infinite, when the future should stretch out like an open road. But Theodora had not known that kind of innocence for some time. She was a princess of Byzantium, last daughter of a dynasty that had ruled for over 1,000 years, and for as long as she could remember, the empire had been dying by degrees. This morning she somehow knew would be different. This morning had a different quality to its silence. Constantinople was never truly silent. Even in peace, the city hummed with the sound of 1,000,000 lives pressed together inside ancient walls. Merchants and monks, soldiers and scholars, fishermen hauling nets up from the Golden Horn, while priests chanted matins in a dozen languages. It was a city that existed at the intersection of everything, east and west, past and future, the sacred and the dangerously alive. For 11 centuries it had stood on its triangle of land between two seas, watching empires rise and crumble around it while it endured. But that morning the sound was wrong. What Theodora heard was not the city waking. It was the city holding its breath. She would have dressed quickly, perhaps moving to a window that faced west, toward the great Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople since the 5th century. Those walls had defeated Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and Vikings. They were not simply stone and mortar, they were faith made physical, the material expression of a civilization's belief in its own permanence. And yet, for 53 days, the Ottoman cannons of a 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed had been speaking directly to that belief. Answering it with thunder, the night before had been filled with ceremony. Emperor Constantine the Elector, Palaiologos, Theodora's kinsman, the last emperor of Rome in the east, had led a solemn procession through the streets. Citizens who had not prayed in years had pressed themselves into the Hagia Sophia, that vast and impossible cathedral whose dome seemed to float above the nave like a captured sky. They lit candles, they sang, they asked God for a miracle that the more honest among them already suspected was not coming. The Theodora would have been among them, standing beneath that golden dome, surrounded by the smell of frankincense and fear, watching the candlelight move across mosaics of emperors and saints who had long since turned to dust. In that moment, the full weight of what she carried must have been almost unbearable. A name, a bloodline, a history so vast it had become a kind of prison. Outside the walls, 100,000 soldiers waited for dawn. And dawn on this morning was coming whether Constantinople was ready or not. It began with a sound that no living person inside Constantinople had ever heard before, and that no one who heard it that morning would ever forget. The Ottoman cannons had been speaking for 53 days. The defenders had grown almost accustomed to their rhythm, the way soldiers in long sieges learn to live inside the noise of war, to sleep between bombardments, to measure time by the intervals of destruction. But in the deep hours before dawn, on May 29th, the rhythm changed. The intervals collapsed. The thunder became continuous, a rolling, unbroken roar that seemed to come not just from outside the walls, but from beneath the earth itself, as though the ground was trying to swallow the city whole. Theodora would have felt it before she heard it clearly, a vibration in the stone floors of the palace, a trembling in the walls, the kind of physical sensation that bypasses the mind entirely and speaks directly to something older and more animal, something that simply knows this is the end. Mehmed had planned it this way with cold precision. He had kept his troops in deliberate rest the day before, conserving their energy while the defenders of Constantinople had spent a sleepless night in prayer and patrol. Now, in the darkness before sunrise, he unleashed everything. Janissaries, Anatolian infantry, irregular troops, wave after wave, crashing against walls that were already cracked and bleeding from weeks of bombardment. The defenders, numbering perhaps 7,000 against an Ottoman force of 100,000, fought with the particular ferocity of men who understand they are fighting not just for their lives, but for something that cannot be replaced. Emperor Constantine XI was among them. This last of the Roman emperors had shed his imperial regalia sometime in the chaos of the final assault. He fought in the streets like a common soldier, which is to say he fought like something more than an emperor, like a man who had decided that if his empire was going to die, it would not die watching him run. Byzantine chronicles record that he was last seen charging into the thickest press of Ottoman soldiers near the Pempton Gate, disappearing into the crowd of battle like a stone dropped into dark water. No body was ever conclusively identified. History swallowed him whole, and in doing so made him immortal. The walls did not fall all at once. They never do. Cities die the way empires die, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a series of smaller surrenders, each one making the next one easier. A gate forced open here, a section of wall abandoned there, a commander killed at the wrong moment, leaving a gap that becomes a flood. The Kerko Porta, a small, almost forgotten postern gate in the northern section of the walls, was found unlocked or forced open in the confusion. Ottoman soldiers poured through it. The cry went up in Greek and then in every language the city contained. The city is taken. The city is fallen. Inside the palace that cry arrived as a sound unlike any other, not a battle cry. Not the roar of cannons, something quieter and more devastating. The sound of certainty, of a thing that had been feared so long finally becoming real. Theodora heard it, and in that moment, 15 years old, standing inside the collapsing center of a 1,000-year world, she made the choice that survivors always make before they know they are making it. She chose to keep moving. She chose to stay alive. The city burned around her as she did. He entered the city on a white horse, and he entered it slowly. This matters. A lesser man, a simpler conqueror, would have ridden in at the gallop, sword raised, voice lifted in triumph, drunk on the violent joy of having taken what so many before him had tried and failed to take. Mehmed Takain did none of this. He rode at a deliberate pace, unhurried, through the shattered gates of a city that was still smouldering, still bleeding, still trying to understand what it had become. He was 21 years old. He had just conquered Constantinople. And he rode as though he had all the time in the world, because in that moment he believed that he did. The world that received him that afternoon was not the world that received him that afternoon. Constantinople in the hours after its fall was a city suspended between two identities, no longer Byzantine. In him, not yet Ottoman, existing in that raw and terrible interval that follows the death of one age before the birth of the next. Fires still burned in the merchant quarters. The streets were crowded with the aftermath of battle, the debris of 53 days of siege, and the single devastating morning that had ended it. Ottoman soldiers moved through the city in organized waves, following Mehmed's explicit orders. There was to be controlled looting for the first 3 days, as was the custom and the law of conquest. But there was to be no destruction of major structures, no burning of the great buildings, no desecration of what Mehmed had already decided he intended to keep. Because here is the thing about Mehmed II that his enemies never fully understood, and that his admirers sometimes overcomplicated. He did not want to destroy Constantinople. He wanted to inherit it. He was, by any honest measure, one of the most extraordinary minds of the 15th century. He had been educated with ferocious intensity: theology, mathematics, astronomy, history, philosophy. He spoke Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin with varying degrees of fluency. He read voraciously, and what he read most hungrily were the histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, two men who had built worlds rather than simply broken them. From boyhood, Mehmed had understood something that eluded most rulers of his age, that the greatest conquest was not military but conceptual. It was not enough to take a city, you had to take its meaning, and Constantinople's meaning was enormous. It was not simply a city, it was a statement, the living, breathing argument that Rome had not died, that the Christian Empire had endured, that civilization had a continuous thread running back through the centuries to the ancient world. By taking it, Mehmed was not merely expanding Ottoman territory, he was making a philosophical claim. He was saying, that thread runs through me now. I am the heir of Rome. I am Caesar reborn in the East. When he reached the Hagia Sophia, he dismounted. Those who were present recorded that he stood before it in silence for a long moment before entering. Inside, he walked slowly through its vast interior, beneath its impossible dome, through the filtered light that fell from its high windows like something between air and gold. He found a soldier chipping marble from the floor, looting the stones themselves, and struck the man with his own hand. The building, he declared, belonged to him, and what belonged to him he would protect. He ordered the Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque. He ordered the city renamed. He ordered his administrators to begin the immediate work of reconstruction, repopulation, and governance. And then he turned his attention to what the fall of a city always produces alongside its rubble and its grief, its survivors. She was brought to him sometime in the days that followed the fall, and the world held its breath without knowing it was doing so. The exact circumstances of how Theodora Palaiologina came into Mehmed's presence are not recorded with the clinical precision that modern historians prefer. The sources we have, fragments of Byzantine chronicles written by survivors in exile, scattered references in Ottoman administrative records, and the careful reconstructions of later scholars working from both traditions, give us the shape of what happened without always filling in its finest details. But the shape itself is remarkable enough. A 15-year-old princess of the Palaiologos dynasty, last of a imperial bloodline that stretched back 2.5 centuries, standing before the man who had just ended everything her family had ever built or been. Picture what she looked like in that moment, not as an icon or a symbol, but as a person, a girl who had not slept properly in 53 days, a girl who had spent the final hours of her empire's life in prayer beneath a golden dome, listening to cannons rewrite the future. She would have been pale with exhaustion, dark-eyed from sleeplessness, wearing whatever clothing had survived the chaos of the city's last morning. The imperial finery, the ceremonial weight of Byzantine court dress, all of that belonged to a world that had ceased to exist. What stood before Mehmed was something rawer and more essential than a princess in her regalia. It was a human being at the absolute outer edge of endurance, still upright, still breathing, still present. And Mehmed looked at her with those dark, calculating, endlessly curious eyes, and something passed between conqueror and captive that the chronicles struggle to name. He was, remember, 21 years old himself, a young man who had grown up reading about the Palaiologos dynasty in the very Greek histories he had studied with such hunger. He knew her name, he knew her lineage, he understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, exactly what she represented. the living human remainder of a civilization he had spent his entire young life preparing to absorb. She was not simply a prisoner. She was, in a very real sense, the last paragraph of a story he had been reading since childhood. Byzantine sources suggest that Theodora carried herself with composure in this encounter, that the bearing of her dynasty, the centuries of imperial training encoded into every Palaiologos from birth, did not abandon her even here. There is something almost unbearable about this detail, the way it speaks to what royal upbringing actually produces in its finest moments. Not arrogance, but a kind of structured courage, a learned ability to hold oneself together when everything else is falling apart. What did they say to each other? Here the sources grow tantalizing in their silence. We know that interpreters would have been present. Greek speakers in Mehmed's court were not rare. Given his own fluency and his deliberate cultivation of Byzantine scholars, we know that the encounter was not brief, that it involved some degree of genuine exchange rather than the simple processing of a captive. And we know from what followed that Mehmed emerged from it, having made a decision that surprised the people around him. The ruins of Constantinople lay outside the windows. The smell of smoke still hung in the air like a curtain that had not yet been drawn back. Somewhere in the city, the last echoes of the empire that had built those walls were fading into the particular silence that follows catastrophe. And in that silence, a 21-year-old sultan looked at a 15-year-old princess and made up his mind. Let us be precise about what Mehmed could have done, because the weight of what he chose only becomes clear when you understand the full range of what was available to him. Under the laws and customs of 15th century conquest, Ottoman, Byzantine, and broadly European alike, a captured royal woman was a resource. She was leverage, currency, a living piece in the diplomatic chess game that always followed the military one. She could be married off strategically to cement alliances, held as a hostage to extract concessions from relatives in exile, displayed as a trophy to communicate the totality of a conqueror's victory, or absorbed into a royal household in ways that ranged from the relatively dignified to the unspeakable. History offered abundant precedent for every one of these options. History, in fact, expected them. Mehmed's own court expected them. The men around him, his viziers, his commanders, his administrators, were practical men who thought, in the language of political utility, they had just taken the most symbolically significant city in the Christian world. The Palaiologos princess was part of the spoils of that taking, and spoils had a logic that everyone in that court understood. To deviate from that logic required not just mercy, but will, the specific, deliberate, politically costly will to say, not this one, not this way. Mehmed said it. The precise form of his decision, reconstructed from the available sources, was this: Theodora Palaiologina would not be absorbed into the imperial harem. She would not be used as a diplomatic hostage. She would be treated with the dignity appropriate to her birth, kept safe under Ottoman protection, and her future would be determined not by the brutal arithmetic of conquest, but by something approaching genuine consideration of her circumstances and her person. This was not a small thing. It was not a casual kindness extended without thought. It was a deliberate political and personal statement made by a man who understood exactly what he was saying and to whom he was saying it. By extending this mercy to the last Palaiologos princess, Mehmed was communicating something layered and complex. To his own court, to the Byzantine diaspora now scattering across Europe, and perhaps most importantly, to himself. To his court he was saying, I am not merely a conqueror, I am a ruler, and rulers think beyond the appetites of the moment toward the architecture of what comes next. The Byzantine world I have absorbed is not a carcass to be stripped. It is a living tradition that I intend to govern, and you will treat its remnants accordingly. To the Byzantine diaspora, those scholars, nobles, and churchmen now fleeing to Venice, Rome, and the courts of Western Europe, he was sending a message that was equal parts reassurance and propaganda. The monster they were describing, their exile pamphlets, the destroyer of civilization, the enemy of Christendom, that creature had just protected the last princess of the dynasty he had defeated. What did that do to the narrative? What did that do to the clean story of villain and victim that the West was already constructing around the fall of Constantinople? It complicated it, deliberately, skillfully, completely. But there is something else here that the political analysis alone cannot capture, something that lives in the space between the documented facts and the human reality behind them. Mehmed had spent his entire life studying the civilization he had just conquered. He had read its histories, absorbed its philosophy, learned its language, admired its architecture. In some profound and perhaps unresolvable way, he did not want it to simply disappear. And Theodora, young, composed, carrying her dynasty's dignity like a second skin even in the ruins of everything, was the most vivid possible embodiment of what he was trying to preserve rather than destroy. He looked at her and saw not an obstacle or an opportunity, but something rarer and more unsettling. He saw a person worth protecting. Survival, when it comes unexpectedly, carries its own particular weight. It is not the clean, triumphant thing that stories tend to make it. It is complicated and asymmetrical, shot through with grief for what was lost, even as it reaches forward to what might yet be possible. Theodora Palaiologina survived the fall of Constantinople, survived the encounter that should, by every historical precedent, have consumed her, and then faced the stranger and in some ways more demanding challenge that confronts every survivor eventually. The question of what to do with the life that has been handed back to you. The years that followed the fall are not easy to trace with perfect clarity. The historical record thins, and fragments in the way that records about women, even royal women, even women at the center of world historical events, so often do. What we can reconstruct comes from a combination of sources. Byzantine exile accounts written by scholars and churchmen who had fled the fallen city and maintained contact with those who remained. Ottoman administrative documents that reference the Palaiologos remnants in the new imperial capital, and the careful detective work of modern historians who have learned to read silences as carefully as they read words. What emerges from these fragments is a portrait of a young woman navigating one of the most extraordinary and disorienting situations that the 15th century produced. Living inside the court of the man who had conquered her world, surrounded by the physical remains of the civilization she had been born into, which was now being systematically and deliberately transformed into something new. Constantinople itself was changing around her with remarkable speed. Mehmed moved his capital there within years of the conquest, renaming it in the Ottoman fashion and beginning the vast project of reconstruction and repopulation that would eventually turn it into one of the great cities of the known world once again. He brought in craftsmen, scholars, merchants, and administrators from across his empire. He restored damaged buildings and commissioned new ones. He was, in the most literal possible sense, building on the foundations of what he had taken, and he wanted the Byzantine tradition to be part of those foundations rather than rubble beneath them. Theodora existed within this transformation as a kind of living hinge between the old world and the new. Her Palaiologos name carried weight in both directions simultaneously to the Byzantine diaspora scattered across Europe. It was a symbol of continuity and loss, a reminder of what had been. To Mehmed's court, it was something to be carefully managed, a piece of the symbolic architecture of the new empire that needed to be handled with intelligence rather than simply discarded. She was, by various accounts, She was, by various accounts, provided with a household appropriate to her status, treated with the formal respect due to her bloodline, and given a degree of autonomy within the constraints of her situation that was unusual enough to be remarked upon. She maintained connections with Byzantine scholars and churchmen who remained in the city, becoming in some accounts a quiet custodian of the cultural and intellectual traditions of her dynasty. Preserving manuscripts, maintaining relationships with the remnants of the Byzantine scholarly community, keeping alive in small and persistent ways the memory of what her family had built. There are suggestions in some sources that Mehmed consulted her, or at least permitted her proximity to the intellectual and cultural life of his court, in ways that went beyond mere decoration. This would be entirely consistent with what we know of him, a man who surrounded himself with Greek scholars, who commissioned portraits from Italian painters, who collected manuscripts from every tradition he encountered. A Palaiologos princess with her dynasty's education and her first-hand knowledge of Byzantine court culture would have been, to a mind like his, genuinely interesting. What she felt about all of this, about the man who had ended her world and then chosen, inexplicably and against every expectation, to protect what remained of her, is not recorded in any source that has survived. The inner life of Theodora Palaiologina remains her own, sealed away in the privacy that history so reliably preserves for women who did not write their own chronicles, but she survived. She endured. She carried her name forward into a future that had no right to include her. And sometimes, in the long story of human civilization, that is the most remarkable thing of all. Every empire ends. This is the one historical truth that admits no exception, no argument, no footnote of qualification. Every civilization that has ever called itself eternal has eventually been proven wrong by time, which is the only force that has never lost a confrontation. Byzantium knew this. In the way that all long-lived things develop an awareness of their own mortality. It was written into the theology, the art, the very architecture of a culture that had survived so many near deaths that survival itself had become a kind of identity. And yet, when the end finally came, on that smoke-filled morning in May of 1453, it came as a shock anyway. Because it always does. What Theodora's story gives us, what it has always given us, even when history buried it under the louder narratives of cannon fire and fallen emperors, is a way of seeing that ending from the inside. Not from the perspective of the conqueror on his white horse, or the emperor who charged into the dark and became legend, but from the perspective of someone who had to live through the morning after. Someone who had to wake up in the ruins and decide, without any map or precedent to guide her, what surviving the unsurvivable actually looks like in practice. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the world that are still, in ways we do not always recognize, reverberating today. It accelerated the flow of Byzantine scholars into Western Europe, carrying with them manuscripts and intellectual traditions that fed directly into the Renaissance, the great flowering of art, science and philosophy that remade the Western world. It shifted trade routes, forcing European powers to seek oceanic alternatives to the overland paths now controlled by the Ottomans, and in doing so, swung in motion the chain of events that would lead to the discovery of the Americas. It redrew the boundary between East and West in ways that shaped every subsequent century of European and Middle Eastern history. And at the center of all this world historical consequence, almost invisible in the traditional telling, was a 15-year-old girl and a 21-year-old sultan making a series of human decisions that defied the logic of their moment. Mehmed's mercy toward Theodora was not simply a personal kindness. It was a philosophical statement about what kind of ruler he intended to be and what kind of empire he intended to build. The Ottoman Empire that followed the conquest of Constantinople was, for much of its early history, a genuinely multicultural and intellectually ambitious enterprise. A civilization that absorbed the traditions it conquered rather than simply erasing them, that produced extraordinary art and architecture and scholarship precisely because it drew from so many sources at once. Mehmed's treatment of Theodora was an early expression of that ambition, a signal sent in human terms about the values that would shape what came next. And Theodora's survival was its own kind of statement. By enduring, by maintaining her dignity and her identity, and her connection to the Byzantine intellectual tradition within the transformed city that had once been her home, she demonstrated something that the clean narratives of conquest and defeat always struggle to accommodate, that civilizations do not simply end. They transform, they scatter, they find their way into unexpected containers and carry forward, changed but not extinguished, into futures their originators could never have imagined. The Hagia Sophia still stands. The city that was Constantinople and became Istanbul still sits on its triangle of land between two seas, still layered with the accumulated memory of every civilization that has ever called it home. If you walk its streets today and look carefully at the stones beneath your feet, you are walking on Byzantium. You are walking on the world that Theodora was born into and that Mehmed chose, in his complicated and ambitious way, to preserve rather than destroy. History remembers the cannons. It remembers the walls coming down and the emperor charging into darkness and the conqueror riding slowly through the smoke on a white horse. These are the images that get carved into monuments and painted onto ceilings and written into the opening chapters of textbooks. But somewhere in the quieter corners of the record, if you look with patience and with the willingness to find humanity in unexpected places, there is a 15-year-old girl standing in the ruins of everything she has ever known, still upright, still present, still carrying her name forward into a morning that should have had no place for her. And there is a young man looking at her and choosing, against all expectation and all precedent, to let her keep it. That choice does not save an empire. It does not reverse a conquest or undo a catastrophe or rewrite the mathematics of history. But it reminds us of something that the ruins, if we listen carefully enough, have always been trying to tell us. But inside even the largest and most impersonal forces of history, there are always two people standing in a room making a decision that is entirely and irreducibly human, and sometimes that decision is the one that lasts.